I'm very happy that he is here. Louis Kyriakoudes.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be speaking before treating physicians and surgeons. Again, I'm a historian, and I have spent a significant amount of the last 15 years studying tobacco industry documents, working with the public health community, and also litigators as an expert witness against the tobacco industry in civil courts in the United States and also in Canada in their litigation as well. And I didn't realize I was supposed to come up with a question to poll the audience, so I'm not tied into that. But the title of my brief talk is really, what is nicotine addiction? Who is to blame for this? 4 points I want to transmit to you. First, nicotine addiction is much more than an individual process. It's a social, it's an economic process. There's a political process and a legal process to it. The tobacco industry, of course, is the vector of infection. It is still an active agent today in promoting addiction, which I see as its own harm. The third point, changes in the technology of nicotine addiction in the way the cigarette has been designed over historical time are critical for understanding how the tobacco industry operates, from the introduction of the first flue-cured cigarettes manufactured by machines to the designs that involved filters, which tried to persuade people to protect themselves, of course, effectively, to lights, ultralights, and other innovations in the 1980s. And now, as we face vapor and e-cigarettes, at each of these junctures in the market for cigarettes, the industry has been able to use those changes to its advantage and to be ahead of regulators in the public health community. And then finally, I just want to show you the documents. I think there's a value to seeing the history and to seeing the words, at least metaphorically touching and tasting what the tobacco industry says internally amongst itself. So that's where we're going today. These are my disclosures. No drug company's ever given me any money to do anything. And I do also have 2 children in college. But I have served as a compensated expert witness for plaintiffs in U.S. Tobacco litigation in U.S. state and federal courts. And I've also been compensated as an expert advisor to the Canadian Department of Justice on these similar issues. Well, let's start with the tobacco industry's position. Smoking is a choice. We have the right to smoke. Smoking is tied to freedom. This is the language of the tobacco industry. So what do they say? What do they say in court? Well, these are on the your left-hand side, a portion from a transcript in a trial, my first trial in 2003, the first one in which Philip Morris lost. What is it all about? Well, this is about choice. The smoker, that smoker, Mr. John Eastman, he could have quit at any time. And so why even bother engage in this legal action? On the other side is another document, again, sharing the same kinds of language. Smoking is a free choice. Anyone can quit. It's easy to do. Oh, it might be a little difficult to quit. That's the language that they're using now. But, work hard. You can do it. Okay, so that's the tobacco industry's position. Well, as a historian who studies the relationships between economic trends, political trends, public health trends over time, how do I conceive of addiction? Well, this is how I do it. And at each point, the tobacco industry has power over what is essentially your typical 15 or 16-year-old teenager who's beginning to acquire or has acquired a smoking addiction and become a regular smoker. Because we all know that this is a disease of addiction that if you avoid it until your early 20s, you will never acquire. So it is principally a children's affliction that is born through the life. We have pharmacological power. That is the manipulation of the impact of cigarette-delivered nicotine through the design of the cigarette itself. It's not just tobacco in paper. We have marketplace power. Advertising, marketing, the availability and distribution of cigarettes is in itself a vector of the dissemination of nicotine addiction. The scientific power, the industry's use of oppositional research is well documented. It's not an exaggeration, as Naomi Orestes has maintained. in Merchants of Doubt that the tobacco industry laid the pattern for current science denialism and climate science denialism. So that is a key component. What's often overlooked is the tobacco industry has engaged not just in medical research, but extensive social and behavioral research. In fact, that area is less well known, but in fact more important, because that's the way they have developed their mechanisms for marketing and making their products more effective in terms of the social process of addiction. There's political power. The tobacco industry in every country has exerted significant political power, particularly in influencing the state on regulatory issues. Legal power. Addiction is also promoted by the lawyers because it is through the extensive protection of the tobacco industry from civil liability, not just in the United States, but in other Western countries, that has allowed it to continue to sell its products and market them in the way it has. And then finally, there's social and cultural power. The industry has individualized smoking. It's developed a language of smoking as an extension of freedom, of individual choice, as glamour, delightful, and wonderful. And what are we dealing with here? Many people think that the tobacco industry is in decline, that cigarette smoking is a problem that's, well, we're solving it. You know, we're moving to e-cigarettes. You know, it was much worse later on, but you know, we're going in the right direction. Well, in many quarters, this may well be true, but let's keep in mind that this is the single most profitable industry in the West. This graph is from a study done by Credit Suisse in return on capital by industrial sectors, and the blue line there, which by the end is a full standard deviation beyond all the other industries, represents the tobacco sector. It's that much money. More money than you can think of, which means power. And again, just to remind ourselves, you're lung cancer surgeons who treat real people. I study, you know, documents and, you know, people that have either died or, you know, faded into the past for one reason or another. Well, let's keep in mind that, you know, cigarettes have not always been with us. This is literally an epidemic. In 1900, consumption of machine-made cigarettes in the United States was infinitesimal. A few million cigarettes a year, approximately 58 per person for every adult in the United States. By the peak in the mid-1960s, consumption is over 4,500 cigarettes per person in the entire United States. In other countries, you simply would have a shift of the curve. Temporarily, U.S. is the leader in this, but the Netherlands and Europe, other countries, the curve looks the same. And of course, lung cancer was an almost unheard of condition in the early 20th century. So there's no question that the two are important, but this is good for us to have some temporal perspective. So what is a cigarette? I think a lot of people don't fully understand what a cigarette actually is, because the last thing it is some granulated tobacco wrapped in paper. It is highly engineered for mass addiction, mass marketing, mass manufacture. It's one of the most inexpensive consumer goods to produce. It's the most heavily promoted consumer good in the West. Just in the United States, money's corrected for inflation and current dollars to advertise the product since mid-20th century to our own time exceeds $200 billion. That's with a B. That's a lot of money. It's man's deadliest invention. It's killed more people than the bullets, the bombs, the tanks, the airplanes, the other weapons of war that we've managed to develop over time. 100 million in the 20th century. If we don't do anything in the 21st century, that number may reach 1 billion, according to WHO estimates. And the two most striking is 1/5 of overall mortality in the West, the United States and Europe, and 10% of overall mortality worldwide are attributable to some smoking-related illness. I mean, that's a lot of death. Of course, and here's the R.J. Reynolds Company, one of their advertisements with a happy doctor talking about how long people live. This is from approximately 1950. So it's designed for addiction. That means mass production plus mass marketing plus nicotine manipulation equals mass addiction, death, and disease. What are the key milestones? I suggested that one of the points I wanted to get across to you was changes in the technology of nicotine delivery. Well, the big initial change comes with the mechanization of the manufacture of the cigarette, which happens in 1881. James Buchanan Duke, benefactor of Duke University in the United States, works with James Bonsack, an engineer from Virginia, and they develop a continuous process machine, which is patented, comes to be known as the Bonsack cigarette machine. With this, they're able to produce, at least from the first machine, 12,000 cigarettes per hour. Contemporary machines now make about 300 to 400 cigarettes an hour. Once the machine-made cigarette is introduced, the chief problem for the tobacco industry is how to sell them. They have no real constraints on production. The next big milestone comes with the introduction of the American blended cigarette, which is a particular formulation heavily reliant on flue-cured tobaccos high in sugar, which have a acidic smoke profile on the pH scale and therefore are easily inhaled. Tobacco industry officials today testify in court that their cigarettes are in fact designed to be inhaled, and the inhalation, of course, is a key factor that makes them so deadly. Then, as the cigarette health debate emerges in the 1950s and 60s, as the science firms up and we have a public health movement against smoking, the tobacco industry responds with filters, lights, low tar, ultralights, and other gimmicks and filter frauds to persuade smokers that they should keep on smoking and not really quit because they don't want that to happen. And now we're in a position with e-cigarettes and vapor inhalers. What is the future? I don't make predictions. I'm a historian. I can only predict the past. I have a pretty good record on that one. But I think the public health community needs to think about these technological changes in the past as they take positions on what state regulations, advertising and disclosure issues, ingredient constituents, ingredient disclosures, and all the other issues that are critical for public health regulation as we move to this new form of nicotine delivery. This is the future of the business. The industry is very clear about that. Yet they still make and manufacture the deadly tobacco cigarette. To what degree will the e-cigarette and the vapor inhalers be transitional devices that addict young people to nicotine and then transition them back to traditional cigarettes is a question I think that we should all be asking as we look at this issue going forward. Well, let's look at some of the history because it's really quite remarkable. In the internal documents of the tobacco industry, the officials are quite frank and they speak quite openly. Of course, their public positions, as it has been until very recently, there's nothing to worry about. Cigarettes are not the cause of any disease, nor are they addictive. They've made those in extensive statements and publicity, and we're all, sworn testimony before the United States Congress and many other venues. This is an excerpt from a 1953 report that's quite famous for those of us that live in the world of tobacco documents by Claude Teague, a young PhD who had just started with the R.J. Reynolds Company at the time, who was given the job of looking into this issue of cigarettes and cancer. Ernst Winder and Everett Graham had just published some of their pioneering research, both epidemiological and experimental research linking cigarette smoking with cancer. And as the document says, studies of clinical data tend to confirm the relationship between heavy and prolonged tobacco smoking and incidence of cancer in the lung. In view of the facts presented in this report, it recommended that management take cognizance of the problem and its implications to our industry. So they're quite upfront. This is in 1953. We've got a problem here. Well, you could fix the problem or not, and or not was their decision. A 50-year strategy of deceit and denial only stopped when massive litigation in the late 1990s pressured the tobacco industry to shut down the agencies of that deceit and denial, the Tobacco Institute and the Council for Tobacco Research. But this is a 1972 document from the Tobacco Institute, the principal lobbying and disinformation organization of the cigarette manufacturers, where they're laying out exactly what they've been doing. We've been creating doubt about the health charge without actually denying it. We've been advocating the public's right to smoke, again that free choice language, without actually urging them to take up the practice, and then encouraging objective scientific research, which of course was anything but objective. What is the business model of the tobacco industry? It has been and always been known within the manufacturers that they're in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. A 1959 document in the files of Philip Morris. Why do people smoke? Well, why do they smoke? Well, right there, number 3, they smoke for addiction. The public position was that cigarettes, nicotine was not addictive, of course. In 1963, Brown and Williamson, then owned by British American Tobacco, Sir Charles Ellis, the chief scientist of British American Tobacco, says we are then in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug, effective in the release of stress mechanisms. Again, it's all about the addiction. Oh, is that the only document? No, we've got plenty. Here's Claude Teague again with the R.J. Reynolds Company. In a sense, the tobacco industry may be thought of as being a specialized, highly ritualized and stylized segment of the pharmaceutical industry. Well, they should be regulated that way then. Tobacco products uniquely contain and deliver nicotine, a potent drug with a variety of physiological effects. Tobacco is in essence a vehicle for the delivery of nicotine, designed to deliver that nicotine in generally acceptable and attractive forms. It's all about the nicotine. Let's go to the 1990s. Another R.J. Reynolds tobacco industry document from their formerly secret files. We're basically in the nicotine business. We need to make sure that we use every bit of nicotine in the manufacture process. Well, it's very profitable. This is one of the most fascinating and interesting documents from the British American Tobacco, which concludes, after discussing how convenient and delightful from the business model that cigarettes contain, essentially, one pack contains a day's supply of nicotine for a habituated, addicted user. It's legal, but unlike alcohol and marijuana, it doesn't intoxicate. And then in the end, they concluded, all we would want then is a larger bag to carry the money to the bank. So, it's about the nicotine and it's about the return on capital. It's not coincidence that this is the most profitable industrial sector in the West. Today, because really this is all about today, what is it? The business is still nicotine. It's still addiction. And the industry right now, both in the United States but also here in the EU, is trying to define addiction not as an injury, not as a harm, but as something that can be amenable to cost benefit. In the United States, R.J. Reynolds is right now suing the FDA partly over developing cost benefit measures for addiction. What are the benefits of addiction? Oh, they must have them. The industry has expended a lot of research trying to come up with those. So rather than portraying this as an injury or an unpleasant aspect of the product, it becomes, in the language of the tobacco industry, a positive practice. And here again, this is from the British American Tobacco website. They are unhappy that some research shows that people are portraying smokers as having a disease. People should be proud of their addiction, I imagine, under this configuration. So it's key to understand the cigarette itself and how it works. It's not just tobacco wrapped in paper. And a seminar on cigarette design the history of cigarette design could take quite a bit of time. Let me just give a couple of examples, which I think are very important. First, the pH of smoke is critical. Sugars fixed in tobacco that create an acidic smoke are essential to the inhalation process. Alkaline smoke, which is characterized typically by large cigars, the hand-rolled type, tend to be not inhaled, difficult to inhale, although I've seen research that shows 10% of ex-smokers who have transitioned to cigars still inhale. So some people will do it no matter what. But as a general proposition, the adjustment of the pH of the smoke is critical to the inhalation process. But within that acidic range, there are further adjustments, and that is the whole point of what's called free-based or ammoniated nicotine. And so nicotine is an alkaloid, and if ammonia compounds, diammonium phosphate, urea compounds, and other compounds are added to the tobacco, typically in the process of making what's called reconstituted leaf, which is a type of tobacco product that's similar to the manufacture of paper. All the organic matter is ground up, run through rollers, pressed, liquid is reserved, and then the volatile and active chemicals put back into the material. If ammonia is added to the tobacco, you're able to raise the pH of the smoke ever so slightly so that you can get deprotonated or free-based nicotine. The key is more nicotine in the form of in the gas phase, less of it in the particle phase or bound to the salt, and therefore more impact kicked and more addictive potential. And this is essentially the secret of the Marlboro cigarette. It's how cool the menthol brands work today. Most mainline cigarettes have this technology in them. And it's, people don't know this, and it's critical to increasing their addictive potential. There's other additives, menthol, licorice, cocoa, other sugars, bronchodilators. All of these help ease smokers into addiction. Menthol is probably the most nefarious of these additives because it's especially attractive to young people. It has a minty sweetness that is quite popular with young people and getting them involved in smoking. Well, did I just make this up? No, of course. We learned this from the documents. I'm a historian, not a chemist. And here we go. Here is a R.J. Reynolds secret report from the mid-1970s. And as you can see there, item number 3, smoke pH and free nicotine. Smoke pH and free nicotine gives more kick. That is the language used in the document right there, which you can read. So you move the pH level up from about 4 to 5, which is a range of traditional cigarette to in the low 6 range, almost close to neutral. Still inhalable, but yet you have this free nicotine process. Marketing is a key factor in promoting addiction. The tobacco industry maintains that advertising does not make people smoke. Plays no role whatsoever. Another story that's not well developed, and I'm working on this right now, is teasing out the history of how the tobacco industry worked with experts in the behavioral sciences and social sciences, marketing experts and economists, to develop theories like the rational theory of addiction, which is a significant intellectual foundation to these ideas, empirical studies looking at the effectiveness of advertising. So you just do a broad population study. Yeah, it's very difficult to find that advertising works because the cigarette prevalence is changing. In the late 20th century, it was declining. So you're going to get, it's going to be quite difficult to get standard easy regressions, which is the statistical test that economists only use. They're fairly simple statistical understanding. In any case, mass marketing is one of the key factors of promoting addiction. You have to look at it that way. Here's some examples. Early advertising in the 1920s, recruiting women has always been a foundation of successful cigarette market, and female smoking has been one of the key features of the cigarette. 19th century, men tended to be the tobacco users. They would chew tobacco or use cigars in gender-segregated places. Once you pull women into the smoking culture and into the smoking process, men and women can use cigarettes together. So look at those countries today where you have high incidences of male smoking and low incidences of female smoking. That's where the market growth is. China would be number 1 on that because China has very high rates of male smoking but very low rates of female smoking. Well, there's a lot of market potential there. Let's go in and simply change the culture. As you can see from the Lucky Strike advertisement, this is linking women's rights and women's liberation in the 1920s, it's a 1920s ad, to the process of smoking. The same thing from the 1970s with Virginia Slim, similar process. So in many ways, these themes have stayed the same when we see this happening in developing markets around the world, even today. You normalize cigarette smoking, you integrate it into everyday life. You put ashtrays in automobiles. Who thought of that idea? You didn't get them until the 1930s. You develop home items for card playing. You have the ashtray. Other items that say it's okay to smoke. The 2 photographs on the right, built-in elevator ashtray. That's from a building just down the street over on Prinsengracht. I was in the elevator there when I was in Amsterdam last spring. And then just a typical Dutch outdoor cafe, again from the spring, not this weather. Again, the ashtray there being a kind of signal to go ahead and smoke. Point of sale and package design are critical. This is why plain packaging is so important today as an effective public health measure. Short of banning the cigarette, we certainly have to have plain packaging, because the package itself is its own advertisement. And again, here are some photographs from here in Amsterdam or in the United States, which shows, you know, everywhere you go where you purchase things, you see the advertisement for the product. The tobacco industry has expended huge energies in researching the social acceptability of cigarettes. And long before the public health community was fully aware of what was happening, the industry was indicating that the declining social acceptability of smoking was a business problem. This is from the early 1980s, long before people were forced to go outside to smoke. And as you see there, they're indicating that you know, if we castigate smoking, we're going to run into a problem. The takeaway here is the tobacco industry could envision the end of the cigarette in many ways before the public health community could. The tobacco industry was dealing with the problem, anticipating the problem of cigarette abolition in the 1970s, long before anybody in the public health field was ever thinking that we should just get rid of this product, that it was too dangerous to be sold, it was unfit for human consumption. Another foundation has always been youth marketing. That is the foundation of the business. This is the 1920s, going and advising the salesmen of the R.J. Reynolds Company to sell their cigarettes to high school students. School days are here, and that means big tobacco business for somebody. Let's go get it. Hasn't changed. This is from the 1970s. The 14 to 24-year-old age group represents tomorrow's cigarette business. And when they mean tomorrow, they don't mean 10 years from now. They mean tomorrow, like tomorrow morning. The industry early on understood that if young people did not develop a nicotine addiction, they pretty much lost that cohort to the business. Youth smokers are replacement smokers, of course, because the cigarette industry is losing smokers. Some quit, not as many as we would like. In fact, quit rates are quite low, but they do exit the population of smokers the other way, which is what we've been dealing with here, through death. And so you have to recruit replacement smokers. And unless you think that doctors have done a really great job, this is a whole area. But doctors are smokers too. I highlight here the Netherlands in 1990, just below a third of, about 29% of Dutch doctors are smoking, at least general practitioners, as high as 45% in 44 and 45% in other European countries just 25 years ago. That's not that long ago. That's not really to criticize people. It's just to say that the medical profession is part of the general population that is amenable to all of the things that I've been identifying. This is a powerful addiction. Labels. Well, the cigarette industry really actually loves warning labels if they're the warning labels that suit their business purpose. Because I mentioned legal power as part of the maintenance of addiction. Well, warning labels have the benefit of acting as a legal shield against civil liability, particularly in the United States, because they can say in court, well, there's been this warning on this pack since 1966 in the United States. We've changed it a little bit. It's not very effective. All the research shows that the warning labels are weak and too generalized and unspecific and overwhelmed by the packaging. But nonetheless, for the industry, this becomes what's called assumption of the risk defense. And they talk about this early on. Here's another report which says the last line is, since the warning label on the package may be a plus, because young people like risk. Risk and danger are fun. And so warnings, at least the way they've been configured, don't work. So is the cigarette industry a legitimate partner for public health? They think so. British American Tobacco admits now that there are real risks to smoking. If there are real risks, then let's not do it. They should be regulated in appropriate ways. Well, what does appropriate mean? We don't want it to infringe on our legal rights to make money. Okay, fair enough. Appropriate, appropriate means no taxes, no plain packaging, no point of sale bans, no restrictions on marketing. So, appropriate for them, not for public health. Let me go back. Here we go. BATCO definitely opposes plain packaging. And let's keep in mind that the tobacco industry, at least from the United States legal perspective, the industry comprised a set of adjudicated racketeers. They were tried and convicted of a RICO, racketeering influenced corrupt organization case by the United States federal government. Their behavior is like the mafia. When effective labels and warning labels are proposed as under the new regulatory regime in the United States, established by the 2009 Family Smoking and Tobacco Prevention Act, when effective warnings are proposed with real science behind them, the industry mobilizes and has sued to prevent these from being used. So these currently aren't being used in the United States. The idea was that these would comprise half of the pack, but that is dead in the water. Again, so the industry is using its legal power, its political power, to advance its interests. They're also opposed to a menthol ban. So, appropriate regulation doesn't mean regulating ingredients that promote the initiation of smoking among young people, such as the minty delightfulness of menthol, as the tobacco industry advertising sometimes describes it. And so, I leave you with a thought that your patients have come from a larger context, a political, social, and economic reality that has put them in their disease situation. They come to you sick, with horrible conditions. But to the degree that it's their fault, I want you to think about that question. Keep in mind the broader historical and contextual elements that have caused this epidemic, and keep to sustain this epidemic. And thank you for having me here.